testimony has been insightful. I've read all of your statements, and one way or another, each of you has either directly mentioned or alluded to elite capture. And I just want to ask, I'll start with you, Mr. Atkinson, Dr. Atkinson. What kind of elites are being captured? Who does the CCP target?
All? Pretty much all the elites. They try. Certainly.
So they'd like politicians. They'd like to trap politicians. They'd like to snare university professors, researchers. They'd like to get media.
Think tanks.
Think tanks. They would like to get control of these folks. I have an interesting one. I thought was interesting. It was because it was by the New York Times, and it talks about the capture of a special interest group called Code Pink, which in 2015 was they condemned China, supported the Uyghurs. By the time 2022 rolls around, Code Pink now is being funded through a CCP cutout, and now it's the Uyghurs who are terrorists, and they are threatening to disrupt the CCP. Would that be an example of elite capture that CCP would pursue?
I'm not familiar with that case. I've read about it. But yes, absolutely. That would be a good example if that were the case.
So I'll ask some other questions here. Now, Dr. Thayer, in your book, I'm going to dovetail on this here. Are there specific departments or offices within federal agencies that are particularly vulnerable to CCP influence or neglecting the seriousness of the threat?
Yes, sir. Yep.
And why do you think these departments are susceptible, and can you name some of those departments?
Well, as a rule of thumb, all departments and agencies are going to be vulnerable to that capture. Clearly, the CCP would be putting priority on national security departments and agencies, but it's a problem which is endemic to the federal government, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments.
And I meant to ask you, Ambassador Sella, about the Goshen case, because you, in your opening statement and in your written remarks, you talk about what I would call classic mechanisms to capture elite. Would you expand on that, please?
Textbook, engaged with my former ambassadorial colleague, Peter Hoekstra, former congressional colleague of yours, in this endeavor. And from the outset, Congressman, the intertwining of this PRC-based and CCP company, the CEO, Zhen Li, and his son are both members of the Chinese People's Consultative Congress, the policy advising body for the Chinese Communist Party, United Front Work Group. They have a 1,000-talent station in their office in California that vacuums up people, intel, intellectual property by its nature. They intertwined early, working government elites, business elites, economic development organizations, and requiring them to sign the binding and punitive 5- and 10-year non-disclosure agreements, again, radically contrary to the published memo from the NCSC of July 22 that require them to do just the opposite. And it's skirted by those federal agencies that need to be watched. Correct.
CFIUS.
Yes, sir.
So we've talked about elite capture a little bit here, and now I think we want to go into how, because all of you mentioned somewhere or another, this is not unlike or dissimilar from the post-World War II Cold War competition, adversarial relationship we had with the former Soviet Union. But it is really distinctive, and Mr. Atkinson, Dr. Atkinson, you pointed out in one way earlier, and that is there's a coupling of there's an economic integration, right? There is an economic integration between China and the U.S. today. So if we were to actually treat China, in particular because of the CCP, as the geopolitical adversary it really is, my question is for all of the panelists, how do you disaggregate or decouple our relationship? Specifically, I'm going to mention critical minerals, which we are dependent on. Our supply chain is dependent upon China. And if you want Green New Deal EV stuff, you got to have the critical minerals that we don't allow to have developed here. And so with that, I'm going to ask all of you to respond. We'll start with Dr. Thayer going down the line.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for the question, Congressman Biggs. What needs to be done is to change the paradigm, to change the way that we think about China, right, and recognize that the CCP is in control of it. It's a malign force which is targeting us for destruction, and act accordingly. So we need to move from an engagement paradigm, if you will, to one which is a realistic paradigm, recognizing the nature of the geostrategic threat that we face. With respect to critical minerals, of course, that's absolutely essential. It's a major vulnerability that we pose, as we've discussed earlier, and ensuring that our supply chains are not affected by that, as well as how those minerals would feed into, of course, the defense industrial base and other critical technologies is should be one of the top priorities that we have.
So as a think tank, we've been focused on the China challenge since 2008, and I would challenge anybody to suggest that we're weak on China. But what I will say is I worry sometimes about the complete decoupling argument. We should be selling Starbucks in China. I mean, what difference is it? We should be taking as much money out of the Chinese economy as possible. So, for example, the decision to cut off Intel sales and Qualcomm sales to Huawei of chips was a mistake, because Huawei got those chips on their own, and all we did is weaken a company who's already in trouble, which is Intel. So I think what we need to do is we need to make sure that we decouple on the most critical parts. And in terms of rare earth minerals, there's really two parts of that answer. One is we need a regulatory system that allows it to be built. But the second and most fundamental is we need a tariff floor, because what the Chinese do is they do predatory pricing. As soon as somebody wants to get in the market, they undercut the price, drive them out of business, and everybody knows that's the deal. So if we set a tariff floor that says you cannot sell this below a cost, and we get our Canadian and Australian allies with us, then we build the security for companies to be able to invest in rare earth. Absent that, I don't see it changing very much.
You may have seen Congressman Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell the other day say, frankly, the Cold War pales in comparison to the multifaceted challenges that China presents. So I think you take his words and you look at our foot posture, and it's not commensurate with the threat. So I really think under the umbrella of a more modernized version of the National Security Act of 1947 that engages the China threat head-on is vital, and it'll work within the intergovernmental agency.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think as we consider decoupling, we have to think about the overall strategy. Obviously, we got to start with security areas that relate directly to security and military affairs. And then I think we should move kind of to the next layer of strategic industries, the places that are going to command the fourth industrial revolution, and what's the U.S. position vis-a-vis China and indeed the rest of the world there. And then I think a third pillar of the strategy is about, again, we think often in these U.S.-China terms, we should think about how do we expand our trade ties with the rest of the world to put ourselves in a more competitive position, but also make ourselves less reliant on China and more resilient in the face of the challenge.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Connolly from Virginia.